All right. We have a fabulous lineup. Thank you all for everybody who has joined us for our webinar today, our conversation. It's less webinar and more conversation. My name is Cleveland Justis, and I'm the founder and principal of Potrero Group. And I'm mostly here to get out of the way and allow our panelists to shine. These panelists are absolutely, this is just a dream panelist. When we put on these webinars, we imagine that people would love to have come, and every one of them said yes. And the people that have been huge mentors and friends for a long time, you have their bios, so I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to tell you why I invited them to the webinar, and then we'll kick off with a question. So just on the screen that I have here, Lisa Maulhardt is with SYPartners. Lisa works primarily with Fortune 100 companies. We've known each other for almost 20 years, and she is noteworthy for her work with Starbucks and IBM and many leading companies for helping them navigate periods of crisis and massive change. Maureen Sidonin is the president and CEO of Goodwill in Northern California. She is an unbelievable leader. She's been
I'm
a
in
founder.
Habitat, Cleve, sorry.
Sorry, Habitat. What did I say? Goodwill. I'm sorry. You were at Goodwill. Now you're at Habitat. And yeah, good. Always interrupt me if I'm off course. And she was there before. She is a founder of an organization called Youth Leadership Institute, and she's the board chair of the Marin Community Foundation, and an awesome human being. Next awesome human being is Kirsten Toby, who currently is the Chief Operating Officer of Save the Redwoods League. She, before that, was the founder and Chief Impact Officer, lots of other roles at Revolution Foods, which started as a business plan at Haas Business School and turned into an amazing nationwide organization serving over 1 million meals a week to underserved students, and revenue, Kirsten, over 100 million. Yes, it's amazing. And Will Shafroth is just stepped down recently as the president and CEO of the National Park Foundation. Will has an incredible career within Congress, in foundations, in land trusts, and is also an amazing human being and got a lot to learn. Each one of the leaders here have just amazing background, and my job is to pull it out and keep us rolling. So I encourage everybody to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A. There's a tab in Zoom, which probably you're all familiar with, for Q&A. And so between Stephanie, my colleague, and I, we'll do our best to get to those. If you don't know Potrero Group, we are a nationwide consulting, executive search, and board placement and enhancement organization, primarily focused on environmental organizations, conservation organizations, who are some of our clients. And we'll take that down a moment. Again, here's our panelists and speakers, and we will take this down. And I believe, Steph, unless you have anything I missed, I'm going to kind of jump in with our first question. So what I would like each of the panelists to cover here, which would be, but I'll start with you, Will, which is, and I'll give you about a minute or so just to kind of address this question to warm up, is how have you approached succession planning in the past, and what worked well, what didn't, and anything that you want to share on this topic to get us rolling. By the way, I gave the panel full rein to be a little controversial and to have some strong opinions. So if that comes out, I hope it does. So don't be shy, Will, or anybody else. So Will, take it away.
Well, we've all been trained well by Cleve, so we can't help but be somewhat controversial just by our nature of being around you, Cleve. So thanks for everybody for joining us today. I kind of look at the question that Cleve talked about, and I think about succession planning or leadership planning, not just necessarily at the senior level. Some of our organizations are big, and there are lots of leaders. The foundation, I considered 20 to 22 people to be leaders, the people that I had to be thinking about. And so I really think about it as sort of an internal strategy and an external strategy. First of all, you got to hire the right people that you can imagine them succeeding to other positions within your organization. I think you always got to keep an eye on your top performers and imagining, what else they might be able to do to support and advance the mission of your organization. I think mentors are a great idea to assign people mentors to allow them to continue to grow in ways that they might not find that on their own. And I think it's good for both sides of that equation. I had people shadow me from time to time to kind of expose them to at least what kind of leadership I had to exercise in my job and to give them a little bit of a different frame of reference on what they were doing presently. And then the last internal strategy was, setting goals together to make sure that they continue to reach. And so it was helping these people potentially succeed into other jobs in the organization or into the leadership, into the executive leadership. I'd also say there's just a couple of external strategies. I won't talk much about those, but just to keep those in mind, I'm intentional about keeping in touch with my former employees from 20, 30 years ago, even. And some of them have been able to come back in to organizations I've worked for later in life. And uh, so I just feel like that's a good thing. Or you can help them find other jobs that you hear about that they might be a good fit for, that they can assume a leadership position. Stay in touch with the broader community, like students, staff of organizations you work with or serve on the board of, even children of friends. I have a lot of younger people in my life who keep in touch, and I again try to see how we can help them succeed in their work. And finally, keep in touch with people like Cleve, who've got their finger on the pulse of who's out there and what's going on and who we should be looking for. Because it's always seems to be coming around that you need to be in touch with somebody like Cleve to plug you in with somebody good. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Will, and I appreciate that, and I want to underscore something you said, which is keep your network activated. It's one of the things I've learned from you is so often people activate you or reach out when they need something. And one of the things I have learned from you, Will, is you reach out when you don't need something, just to stay in touch. And that is something very, very few people do, particularly at your level. And you send updates, you let people know what you're doing, and then there's no ask. And I know you're a great fundraiser. You've raised over $1 billion, but maybe it's because I'm not your target market, but it is something that's really admirable. So, okay, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you to answer that question.
Sure. Thank you. So I work primarily with corporations, and there's a little bit of a different dynamic sometimes between that and the kind of not-for-profit world or broader public sector. When it comes to CEO, I'm glad, Will, that you brought up succession planning more broadly. CEO succession planning typically still happens at the board level, but you'd be surprised how often it doesn't happen until way too late, and how often the organization doesn't know who's responsible for it. So CEO, usually you can assume board within the organization. I think one of the things I've learned the hard way is being really clear about who owns succession planning. Is it the head of HR? Is it someone else on the executive team? Who's going to take this on? Because everyone thinks everybody else is doing it, and then you end up kind of caught with your shorts down, which is kind of behind my biggest learning and kind of guidance here, I guess, if we're going to be giving that, which is I think succession planning actually requires a mindset shift, a mindset of impermanence in the organization. And when you have that, you're constantly looking at who's growing in what ways, who might be invited to a meeting because it's a learning opportunity, who should be tagging along with this leader because they're going to hear how that leader engages with clients or whatever the business is. Some companies have term limits for their C-suite, and that's helpful because it embeds a mindset of impermanence and constant thinking about succession planning. But most start too late. And these days, people are pretty conservative in these organizations. They really don't want a lot of change from outside. Big shift in the past 2 to 4 years. So they're looking internally, and by the time they start it, a lot of the folks that they would have tried to bring along have left. And attrition suddenly is your biggest enemy here. So that mindset of like, we got to be constantly thinking about people, constantly asking, should this person have this opportunity and let's see how they grow on their own. We have worked with Amex quite a bit, and they have an interesting ritual. And I think ritualizing this mindset can be helpful. But one of the teams in Amex, at least a few years ago, would do something where they would, once a year, they had a ritual of kind of looking at all their employees in the business unit, and they'd say, it wasn't in or out. It was this person is doing great at these things. This person needs help in these things. How do we pair them with someone who can teach them? But then they would say, for every single person, they'd say, who's ready for a promotion in 1 year and who's ready in 3 years? And on the 3 year people, then it triggered a thought of, okay, well, what do we got to be doing? Why do we think it's 3 years? And what do we have to put in place for them to get there within those 3 years and get there effectively? And I think ritualizing the mindset of thinking this may all shift under us and we should be a couple steps ahead of ourselves is really, really important.
Thank you. Terrific perspective. And I've always believed that nonprofits can learn a lot from corporations, and corporations can learn a lot from nonprofits. And I love cross-pollinating that here, because I don't think any, it's as Good to Great author said, it's not about being more like a corporation. It's about being a great organization and great. And so I'd love that you're bringing in that to this conversation. There's a lot of, I can see from the polls, predominantly nonprofit people, but I think it's how do you pull out the best from those companies and what they think about? Because I do think on this question, corporations are often much better than nonprofits at planning their pipelines. So I really appreciate you bringing that in. Maureen, over to you.
Well, so much wisdom has been shared. So thank you to my colleagues for that. I think a couple things. I think building a leaderful organization and not kind of crossing anybody off the list of, they have leadership potential. Maybe they have a different type of leadership potential, or they'll lead a department, or they'll lead, an initiative, or, they'll transfer skills they have. And so I think it's like looking at the whole person and the whole pipeline in a way that's not so linear. I think often with boards, it's this open conversation with the CEO about succession planning that's not like sending some, backhanded signal that you're kind of thinking that person's almost ready to go. I think it's really about being transparent. I know for me, one of the things I do every year with my board is I say, am I still the right leader for this organization, for where we are and where we're trying to go? Because I don't have a fear of my own leadership ability, but I just definitely want to make sure that it's the right seat and the right person all the time. And so we've had really good, courageous conversations, and I think it's really healthy. It's created a really healthy dynamic. I think the other thing I would say is just, Lisa, your point about pairing people up, finding mix of skills, and it's really changing. I think when we have very intergenerational workplaces, and so you might have somebody who has only been at something for 5 years, but they're like on fire and they really are ready to go and take something. And so I think and in the same breath, you might have someone who's been doing some different things for 30 years and they're ready to go in a different way. And so I think it's just, you can't get in this sort of traditional mindset that it's age or it's years of work, or it's sort of like challenging your own assumptions and then being able to kind of create opportunities. And, I'm very fortunate, blessed right now, because I have such an amazing leadership team, and they're all really capable, competent, and it's sometimes a management challenge because they're so good. It's like, whoa there, whoa. But sometimes it's like that's the greatest problem to have, right? Is that you're trying to figure out how do you apply that, how do you do that? So for me, it's about building leaderful organizations, not anointing or appointing anybody prematurely, having conversations about where's the organization, what are the organizational needs, and what are the skills that we need to apply right now, and opening up the aperture to look beyond just a field that you're in. I think sometimes in in nonprofits, we kind of go, this person's an environmentalist, and this person's a houser, and this person's a health person. I came into Habitat almost 10 years ago not knowing a thing about affordable housing, construction, loans, and I've learned it all alongside these other great leaders. But you can come in somewhere and take the skills you have and really learn. And I think keeping that opportunity open for leaders to come in and step up to the challenge, because it is, many are called and few are chosen, right? And so I think it's that opportunity to exercise that.
I love that you brought into the intergenerational component of this, because that's, I was a panelist on a webinar yesterday for career seekers and career changers. And I think one of the things I was trying to emphasize there is that when you're sitting in my seat, often when I'm interviewing people, is I'm trying to see that they're lifelong learners. And increasingly, as workforce ages, it's going to be really critical for people to be relevant across the whole spectrum of very multi-generational, intercultural workplaces. So I love that emphasis, because I think that's something we really sometimes forget. And I think I have my own biases around age, which is, I think because I'm older, I'm wiser, and that's not true. And so I think really appreciate you bringing that in. Kirsten, tell us.
Thanks. Well, I mean, there's a lot of great wisdom that's been shared already. So I think the maybe new angle I'll bring into this is, I think succession planning it can be different depending on the type of organization, and specifically like depending on the growth rate of the organization, because I've been a part of very fast growing organizations where, you don't necessarily have time to be, having all the mentoring programs and having, there's just, when you're in a high growth environment where you're cash strapped and impact focused, it's a lot harder, I would say, to be sort of thoughtful about succession planning. And then so sort of like growth rate is one dimension. And then I think succession planning is really different when you're talking about somebody who's sort of a founder or in a founding role. And having been a co-founder, of a social impact organization, I think founders have a real fear of talking about succession planning in a way that many other executives may not, because there's so much of a personal identity wrapped up in building an organization. And I say sort of founder or founder-like, which could be somebody who's been in the role for 10 or 15 or 20 years, somebody whose identity really has become synonymous with the organization. So I would say, having learned both the hard way and learning how to do it better, I think just the idea of no matter what kind of leader, somebody is, the importance of communicating about succession planning. When I was a co-founder, I think my co-founder and I both sort of did not talk about succession planning with each other or with the board for a good 12 years because we were afraid to, right? And I think once we started becoming more comfortable with the idea that, we may not be the forever leaders of this organization, that sort of opened up a conversation in a way that I wish we had opened that up, 10 years earlier, when it felt like an impossible conversation to have.
I love that. And it brings up a couple of questions I want to ask you, but I'll just cue this so you think about it, which is, Kirsten, you have an interesting perspective, having done, grown something, from an idea to a very large organization, and now pivoting to an organization that's over 100 years old with a very deep roots and legacy and of impact. And I'm not going to ask that question right now because I'm going to turn it to Will, but I would love at some point in this conversation for you just to talk about that shift that you made and that you're working on with your team, because I couldn't imagine two different organizations, very successful, very interesting, and very innovative, but very different culturally. Okay, Will. So I'm going to now, by the way, ask each panelist a specific question that they've thought about a little bit. But then this also gives everybody in the room a chance to put in questions for them. So this is my request that you put in and use a Q&A feature and put in some questions there, and then we'll get to those after four questions from the panel. So, Will, you've led in a lot of different environments as well, and from government to nonprofits to large foundation, and had to work very, very collaboratively with all three primary sectors, business, government, nonprofits, and have to have people that could speak a lot of different languages, cultural languages. So I'm curious how you've identified throughout your career leadership pipeline and kind of how you have, particularly given the unique environment that you've worked in, um, found those people and developed the new leaders.
Good question, Cleveland. And one of the people you talked about the different sectors, government, nonprofit, business, and one of the people who was best in my team of speaking to the business community was Stephanie Matthew, who's on this call. She's in the audience today, and she headed up our corporate partnership team, and that's a very different kind of communication, as Lisa knows well, talking to corporate leaders, and it is talking to a lot of times just family foundation or a wealthy individual or a member of Congress. And so you do have to your point, Cleve, you have to really identify the leaders who are going to be good at the different parts of your organization. And I think that as a CEO, you kind of have to be pretty good at everything because you never know who you're going to end up talking to in that day and or that week or on that trip. So, communication skills are key, and you can kind of just tell pretty quickly if somebody has that at a highly sophisticated level. And has the kind of judgment to be in those conversations or doesn't, and or maybe they need some more work on it. And so but you can often tell that's they've got that stuff or not, and that's something that's worth pursuing. I think so. Both primarily personal skills. Are they good listeners? Are they able to articulate in an effective and concise way? Do they have good judgment kind of in the moment, and to be able to kind of pivot and navigate challenging conversations, consequential conversations with people who are going to make a difference in the mission of the organization. So I'd say that's really an important one. I think that seeing people's commitment and work ethic is also another one, and then really understanding how what are they willing to do for this, and how in are they? You want people in leadership position to be all in, and that's just true. They've got to demonstrate that this is a priority for them, and they're willing to make time for it, and to some degree, some sacrifice in their lives to be really good and to excel in these kind of bigger roles. That's an important one. I think that there's some subjectivity to this, but do you see the potential in somebody? There's an element of like, do they have something special? Are they exceptionally good at connecting with people? Are they really good at being empathetic with people that are on the staff that really would requires them to manifest their leadership in some important ways to move the organization to manage change and adapt to change is definitely going to happen in any kind of organizations on the phone today. So those are some big ones. And I think that you have to also be willing to recognize when people may either be overpowered for your organization and to kind of help support them to move on, or they may be underpowered and to help them to move on for a different set of reasons. And I think those are all just really honest and kind of tough decisions you have to make sometime to let a good person go because they're a shooting star. You don't have anything for them, or to let them go because they did a great service to your organization from A to B, but they're not necessarily the right person from B to C.
Terrific. Thank you. Love that. Lisa, I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit in my question to you, which is in your clients, and you're dealing with just such massive change often in your clients because they're really big companies, and you often get called in when there's a culture change needing to happen, and when a company has kind of lost its way a bit or wants to regain something. And I'm curious in this question around when you're looking at leadership pipeline and succession planning, how do you help your clients, or how do your clients manage this sort of institutional knowledge versus bringing in new energy? Because a lot of your people come to your companies because they love it. They know the brand, but it also has to evolve. So love to hear kind of some thoughts around that.
Yeah, and so many things that my colleagues here have mentioned are making me think about this question even in a deeper way. Kirsten talking about founders. Founders are a completely unique, create a completely unique kind of dynamic that needs to be thoughtfully handled in these moments. The thing that I've seen most in founder-led orgs is the executive team around them saying, please teach me how you see this. Please show me the thing that is in your gut. Help me learn that so that I can take this place forward. And it's can be an impossible thing to do. And so really do have to think about this systemically in a whole different way. It occurs to me too, in listening to a couple of you, that an an organization, we can think about it a lot through the lens of ecology, actually. You're trying to build a regenerative system, ultimately. If we believe in this organization, what it can do, the impact it can have, how do we think about it through that lens? And how do you constantly feed it with the stuff it needs? And as Will was saying, help it shed some of what it's been sometimes, which can be actual humans. And then to Maureen's point, have the humility and honesty to with yourself to recognize the edges of your own competency and where those are, what era in the generative cycle of this organization you were best suited for. And we're not all best suited for every era in those organizations. So that personal recognition, I think, is really important. Um, but I think I'd say a couple things about holding on to what's been great and making space for what needs to be great in the future. A couple of people brought up mentorship. I wasn't even really thinking about that, but I had a recent conversation with someone that you're all sparking in my brain, which was a guy who's has a big role with the U.S. Armed Forces, and he was telling us about how language matters so much that they've actually taken the word reverse out of their mentorship program when he talks about this new program they have. Because he's like, we have to think about mentorship going up and down the chain. I don't care what the hierarchy is. And so they actually have younger people who are very AI native, you'd say, teaching people way higher than them in rank about AI and its implications. And someone said, "Oh, it's reverse mentorship," and he was like, "You know what? That's dangerous. That just reinforces a hierarchy. I actually need to get people to not think about hierarchy in these moments." So I think that's one great way to do it. But I'd say in general, like if I zoom out a little bit, you need to design the transition really thoughtfully between one leader and the next. That's the way you figure out and make space for new while holding on to the things that you need to hold on to. And with that design, in ideal circumstances, you've got the outgoing leader sticking around for a bit. You've got them shepherding that new leader through certain key moments and having them show up alongside them to show them what happens, to help them help debrief it afterwards to see what are you gonna face in a moment like this? You've got ritual handoffs that the organization is used to having one person do, and now this next person's going to take them on. You actually have them show up, you have them own it alongside that outgoing leader. So it shows that we're both open to new and we care about the things that do matter and do drive the culture today. You can create a listening and learning plan for that incoming leader so that they are starting to soak in what's been kind of like I don't know, maybe not the golden tablets of the organization, but the story operating system of the organization. They take in the folklore, they understand how people talk to each other, and they show up open and just truly listening, not with any opinion, but you build that into the ritual of transition. And then also constantly communicating to the organization where you are in the transition. So and so is staying around this much longer. This is what the new person's doing this week. And you get the organization to feel like they're part of that change. I think that can be really helpful because then the organization knows how much to cling to, how much to let go of, and it kind of creates space for that. I also think it's important to remember that in these moments of transition, you treat them, or at least consider taking the opportunity to change a lot of things. And those things might look like, or maybe I should say big things. It can look like your wider performance and leadership structure and strategy. The organization gives a little permission in those moments, even if they're fearful. There's an expectation in the back of everyone's head that something's going to shift here. And if it needs to shift, this is a good time to make certain things happen. You don't want to saddle an incoming leader with a layoff, for example, on day 5. but you may want them to recognize that there's a major anniversary in the company's life cycle. Let that leader step and say, because we're turning X age, we're going to rethink our purpose. I mean, involve everybody of you, all of you, in thinking about how to bring the mission to life in new relevant ways. It just introduces this idea that things can shift without it being the whole house falling down on itself. Um, and it also liberates that leader to have a little bit of space to try to move the organization into a new place rather than feel like it's just got to hold on to old ways and kind of keep plodding along. So take that moment as permission and consider the things you might change. You don't have to, but consider the things you might change.
Thank you, Lisa. Love that. Maureen, I'm going to shift your question just a little bit, but I'm going to maintain the spirit of the question, which is we've had a number of people ask about smaller organizations, and you run a very large organization. All of you run large organizations, but I know that you have served on the board of others. You fund others. You were the founder of one that was only you at one point. So I'd love just to kind of shift a little bit, just so we bring in the voice, because I know there are a number of people from smaller organizations or board-run organizations. So I just want to bring that into the conversation a little bit so those folks can get your wisdom, because you've seen all different sides of that. But I'll get to the question, which is, how does internal succession planning play in resilience and long-term planning? And I'd say, and maybe a little bit to the smaller organizations that you've either run or seen or funded in your career as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because I think sometimes there's always this perception that if you're small, that means you somehow have a problem with scaling. And I think that's just false. I think that there are really strong, very smart, very thoughtful, very high impact organizations that do a lot, that aren't necessarily designed to be a scaled organization and be large. And so I think that's one thing, is just to take the premise of, where is this organization? I mean, there are times when it's like, hey, we have this opportunity to grow, and the leader we have as the founder isn't the person to do that. And that's a different, a different calculus. But I think that what I've seen is it's as important for small organizations to, really focus on, again, building their leadership pathway, thinking about leaders across the organization, both on the board and the staff. A lot of times with smaller organizations, one thing I do see is that the boards are actually the problem. They're getting in the way of organizations really building the strength and muscle and impact that they, kind of are born to have. And so I think that it's sort of a board check too on that leadership level to make sure that that's being looked at. And another thing I would say is, when I first started Youth Leadership Institute, I mean, I was 27 years old and I didn't know much. But what I knew was young people were being locked out of decision-making rooms in decisions that impacted them across the board, whether that was health or education or activism or whatever it was. And so when we sort of got started, and we were me, and then we added a second person, we were two, when we grew to, when I left, when we started, we had, $100,000 budget. And when I left 20 years later, we were at about $6 million. And so, but the thing was that we were a capacity building organization. We were a policy and philanthropy sort of training adults to how to best help young people unleash their incredible power and leadership. And I say that because then what happened was, as we built and grew, we had a lot of incredibly smart people that came in, and they would leave. And at first I would be really offended, like, why are you going? This is the greatest path ever. And it was like they were going to lead another organization. And I saw that one of the things we did, which was ironic to me, and I did kind of had this blinding, flash of the obvious 10 years later, which was, oh, I see. We were a leadership institute. We were building leaders, and they were going to other organizations to lead. This is actually a good thing. So I think once I embraced that and sort of understood that and kept, and as William said, kept in touch with people and saw their growth and their trajectory and their impact, it sort of like all became okay. And I think that that's just a lesson learned for me was, I think my ego got in the way of like, well, no, you can't leave me here. I'm on this island and we need to continue to fight. And I think what I learned about leadership was, no, interacting with people, building a relationship with people, knowing people, seeing their magnificence in action, and seeing the joy be applied to what they do, and then seeing the transformation and change happen was worth the ride and worth the road. And they didn't belong to me. It's kind of like your kids, right? You raise your kids and you're like, woo, where'd they go? And the truth is, like, I'm really proud of where they are and what they're doing. And so I think it's a similar thing in an organization. Like, you get this sense of, like, if I can just see and understand the moment in time or the moments in time or the years in time that that leadership has been applied and let it out into the universe in the for the good of the order of a lot of organizations and other places, it's an amazing and awesome feeling. And then I just have great colleagues after that.
Thank you. I'm glad we could bring in that a small organization. I know Will wanted to add in on this before I get to you, Kirsten, because he's been building one of his legacies at National Park Foundation is helping raise the capacity of small organizations. I don't know if that's where you're going to go, but I'd love for you to.
Yeah, I was executive of three different basically startups. So that's like a really small organization. It's just you, and you gotta figure out where the desk and telephone and the you know you're doing everything yourself, and you grow from there. And I think that Maureen hit it right on. There's different challenges I think that you face with a smaller organization than there are with larger ones. And since a lot of the groups here, both friends groups, land trusts that I've had connection with, it is a lot about growing their capacity. But if it's a 1 or 2 person organization, the skill sets and the requirements are a little different than if it's a 25 or 50 person organization. And so I think that you're right to bring this up, Cleve, because there's some different leadership challenges and different kind of succession challenges. I don't think most organizations with 2 or 3 people necessarily have a big conversation about succession very often. It's because it's more hand to mouth usually, and they're trying to figure out how to get through the year or the quarter. But I think it's a useful thing to be thinking about no matter what. I do agree with Maureen that the board staff relationship is critical to get right early on, because it's oftentimes organizations start with no staff, and so the board is used to doing a lot of stuff, and kind of getting that relationship right can really have an impact on where it goes. So anyway, I don't want to take up much time.
Yeah.
I want to Kristen has to say.
Well, it's a nice segue actually to the question I have for Kirsten, which is how can you kind of normalize succession planning where it's not, you don't wait till there's a crisis, but it just becomes a part of the DNA, particularly in your role as you've grown an organization. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, I was thinking about a couple of, strategies, and some of these sort of emerge kind of organically in organizations, but I think but it's especially important to be focused on them for them, some of the more senior leadership roles that are a little harder to replace in a, short amount of time. And one of those strategies is just sort of keeping an eye out in the organization for whether each role has some kind of a, I don't know what I would call it. In some cases, it's like a partner that sort of knows that role inside and out, that's not necessarily directly working in that role. So sometimes it's sort of a peer relationship. Like in many senses, my co-founder and I had that, even though she was CEO and I was chief impact officer or something else. If she had to go, do something or was sick for a while or, went out on parental leave, I could easily sort of step into that role because I knew the ins and outs of her role, so that and I see that in many different roles in many different organizations. Sometimes it's sort of a deputy person who's sort of, like that person who's the VP of that function, or who's the, senior director of that function, who can step in and really understands and knows that function really well. So just having some of those, almost explicit, who is your kind of work partner that's going to step in if you need to step out. I think, for better or for worse, succession planning, can have to happen temporarily, not just long term, right? Like somebody can get sick, somebody goes on parental leave. In my organization now, we have a sabbatical policy, so we have people who disappear for 6 weeks at a time, and in some ways, like that's a very good. That's sort of the second strategy I would say is sort of think of those moments as a reason to do succession planning. So it's not always just about, oh, what if this person leaves or this person, steps into a different role or a different organization. It's like things can happen anytime to anyone, and somebody can go out for an extended sickness. Somebody can go out for, a much needed long vacation. And who's going to kind of keep the fires burning while that person is out? So being able to have those conversations about the, not necessarily about the departure, but about the, who's going to kind of keep that role functioning is one strategy, I would say. And then I think, just to kind of connect this also to your earlier question about sort of like fast, high growth organizations and slower growth organizations, or, sort of innovative versus more legacy organizations. I think, that's where you have to be sort of intentional about, as you're thinking about succession planning. There are some roles where you might say, you know what, if this person needs to step out of their role for a period of time or forever, this has to be an external recruitment process, right? And so in that sense, always having, as other panelists have mentioned, keeping all of your networks alive and kind of having a sense of who would I reach out to if this role was vacated, either suddenly or with a thoughtful timeline, and just keeping all of those. I think there's never a relationship that's worth not kind of maintaining, right? It's like keeping all of those networks alive and keeping those keeping that thought process going of like, who would I call if this role needed to shift. And then in other cases, it's thinking about internally, like if this role was to turn over or to change, who internally would be the right folks to be stepping up into it. And, as I said in the very beginning, being really explicit in those conversations with folks to have open communication about, who's going to take over for this when you're going out on your vacation next week, right? Or do we need to hire an outside, consultant to come in and do this work because nobody else knows the function, or, is there somebody on the team who knows your role upside and down?
Great, thank you. Love this. One of the, and this is for anybody who wants to chime in on this one. And again, I'd encourage everybody that joined the webinar to keep putting in questions. I'm gonna do my best to get to them. But one of the questions, and I'm just gonna read it, which just says, I live by the right person in the right seat view and agree with that philosophy. But how do you deal with executives who are focused on their control of the organization? This is back to kind of the founder issue, I think, often, or founder-like, in their own vision, and are not open to the idea that they're not the right person in the right role. And there's a lot of ways you could take, whoever wants to take this, or a couple of you take this question, because I think this also applies to another question here, which is around board members. So, how do you manage these complexities where at most of these organizations it's a team-led event, but sometimes people don't know how to do that very well. So, whoever wants to go, just okay.
I'd say it's a lot about the board in this case. Cleve, you hit it already. That I've been in that very situation before, and you just have to have. I think you need to be very respectful in how you do it. Obviously, this person is very likely to have contributed a lot to the organization's mission, and it got them to an important point. To my earlier point, you could take 10 or 12, 15 years to get from point A to point B, and then you're now perched to go to bigger and better places as an organization. And that person, it's not a foregone conclusion they've got the skill set to take it there. And the board needs to step in and really have an honest conversation with them and find a way to make that transition hopefully easy. And I've also been involved with some cases where it's not easy, where they have to, to be shown the door, unfortunately. But you can, it's really, I think the last point I'm making is you really have to have the organization's mission and impact interest front of mind. You can't be too wrapped around the axle around, well, I don't want to hurt this person's feelings, and look how much they've done. And it's really more about where you want to go than where you've been.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I'll just say that a couple times in our work, we engineer in these moments where we're playing out different futures for the organization. Not really hard analytical scenario planning, but we just kind of say, like, what if you were to grow in this way? What if you were to acquire a company like this, and what could that open up for you? And in those conversations, we embed the leadership interrogation of like, what new skills would you need in your executive team? Who would you want on your board? And just getting leaders into a place of imagination can sometimes then get you to the moment where you can have the heart to heart about like, what are you thinking your legacy is going to be here? couching it through the lens of legacy is sometimes helpful too, depending on where again, how long the person's been there, how long the company's been doing what it's been doing. And I've been surprised how many times a leader needs to hear that it's okay to leave.
Mhm.
And to make it okay for people to
Love that.
say, I've done plenty. And you get in these questions about like, what's your biggest fear about if you were to get hit by a bus tomorrow, what's your biggest fear about what would happen here? And so we're lucky to be able to engineer these sort of for instance moments, and it just gets people in a more imaginative space. And sometimes that can be really helpful. And it's something a board could easily do with an executive team if they wanted to.
I love that you brought that in. We're working with 3 founder transitions right now, 33 years, 44 years, and 40 years. And it's amazing how often the founders, um, when you haven't done that pre-planning, they I think subconsciously think that the organization won't survive without them. And I think there's some real interesting dynamics. And I love that you talked about start pre-planning that to help them see that actually the very best thing for this organization often, if you've been around for 44 years, is to retire, is to allow to grow, is it allowed to morph? Doesn't mean you're not effective, and you can still be involved, but it is a real. I love the idea of doing some scenario planning around that beyond just succession planning, which I think a lot of people don't understand or don't want to do. Love that. Kirsten, see you coming up.
Yeah, one thing I'll just add to that is I think that those questions that come up in that conversation of sort of what are you afraid is going to be lost in your own transition is a really good way of thinking through what are the things that are not yet written down in this organization, right? Like and because I think in a lot of cases, and this is again sort of back in maybe in a higher growth or a founder-led organization where people think, oh, this organization is that way because the leader is that way, or because this, the CEO acts in a certain way, but many of those things actually can be, one of the things we did at Revolution Foods was, we did a lot of work to like write down and codify our core values, right? Like what are our core values that, that if we go away tomorrow, we want to make sure live on in this organization. And in some cases, that's like, what is your brand, right? Like, what does your brand stand for? Because your brand is not the person who leads the organization, but in many organizations, it's actually pretty synonymous, right? Think like large companies, that can be the case, and very small kind of impact-driven organizations. So, thinking about what are those, and sometimes it's rituals or it's processes or it's knowledge, like what are those things? And, you may find that leaders sometimes hold on to those things because they're afraid for somebody else to own them, right? But by sort of forcing that question of, how do we actually sort of codify and institutionalize these, these values, these practices, these processes, this IP, whatever it is, that can help on both sides to bring more comfort with a transition.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in, Cleve, if it's okay, and just add a couple things. One, I think is, there's a power and control shift that happens when leadership transitions are happening, and I think that it gets scary for people when they, as you identified, when their identity, and Kirsten mentioned this earlier, if people are wrapped up in their identity being that thing, right? Or people know people as that company or that nonprofit or that role or whatever it is. And I think that part of it is just naming it. I always think about I'm kind of a Brene Brown fan, but I think about that like clear is kind, sort of mantra, which is, I think a lot of times people don't want to say like, we're not going to, no, like we want you to transition out in a healthy way and we want the organization to go and the new person needs some room to come in and do their thing. And I think one thing I feel like I did well. I did other things well too. But when I left YLI, they asked me to get on the board, and I said no. And I did that because I thought that's going to be horrible for whoever takes over. Who wants the founder sitting on their board? Like, it's pretty intimidating. So I just, there may be different in private sector why people do those things, around stock ownership, et cetera. But in the nonprofit sector, we don't have those things. So how do you help people make that transition in a healthy way? And not only do you have to look out for the person who's leaving, and I think that we don't always do a great job at that, but we also have to look at for the person who's coming in and what shifts that's going to bring. And then also, I think on the board, like if you have a rock star board chair and that person's going to shift, that's scary to the person who's sitting in the leadership seat. So it's like, how do you just continue to be clear? This is the lane we're going to talk about. This is what we're going to address. Here's what we're not going to do, and why, and sort of have those conversations. And because what happens to people a lot when there's those people that are over-identified with organizations is people start thinking, well, are you going to stay on? Are you going to be a consultant? And maybe they are and maybe they're not. I don't know. It'd be great to hear some case studies of when that's worked. I've just seen when it hasn't worked. And I think that, many times that's important too, to just sort of have that role clarity and that clear conversation, I think, as you're thinking about it.
There's a question, I'm going to broaden it a little bit, but there's a question around the federal workforce and how, given all that's happening right now, and particularly over the last year with federal employees being let go. And we saw this actually recently with we had a search that was sort of a foundation search that was tied to people that would work at USAID, and we had 1,300 people apply, and it was heartbreaking. But the question really is how can you? I think there's a couple threads to this, and I think that maybe it could be a corporate answer and then a government answer. But as people get laid off or change, how do they think about the one is the people that are still in the government entity or the corporation? How do you, knowing that there's a lot of layoffs, how do you manage the succession within this dramatically reduced workforce? I think the other thing, which I think is maybe part of the question, is how, if you're one of those people that's been laid off and you've invested your career in one area, very specialized for a long time, how do you make yourself relevant in new places? Especially in the USAID example, that's so specialized that it's very hard to pivot. So I'd love anybody, all of you have worked closely with the federal government, so feel free to take it that way, or Lisa, if you want to give it from the corporate layoff perspective, wherever you want to go. Will, I'm kind of looking at you because you've seen this in the federal workforce, but I also, Lisa, want to give you a chance because I know you see.
Yeah, Lisa, you go first this time.
Inside of a company, the one thing that came to mind immediately was after a layoff, thinking about succession planning is you got to actually let the dust settle a little bit. Jumping back into that conversation, unless the succession planning needs to happen because, let's say, a board kicks out the CEO, that's a different thing. But if we're talking about executive team is still fairly intact, and it's about the wobbliness of everybody else in the organization, I think it's well advised to just let things settle for a while. People need to feel their feelings. They need to reckon with the new reality. They need to reckon with the fact that the people who were once there to do things are no longer there. The organization kind of finds its new balance sometimes. And then it might be time for like a formal restructure. Sometimes those restructures are announced when the layoff happens, right? And they're sort of the reason, and oftentimes they are the reason for shedding people. But people have to rewire how they're going to do work, with whom, all that kind of stuff. And so to talk about succession planning in those moments, it's just too soon. You kind of need people to get into the new ways of behaving with one another before you bring that conversation back up.
You want to take it to the government realm, Will, and maybe just kind of the upskilling or making yourself relevant in other sectors if your job's been on.
It's funny because my niece got laid off at the very beginning of USAID's layoffs last March, and so I had no fewer than 20 conversations with her about this very thing because she had to kind of reinvent herself a bit because she had come out of college and gone right into that field and worked there for 7 or 8 years, and like, now what am I supposed to do? So she part of it, I think, sometimes just the necessity of getting work and earning a paycheck and having healthcare benefits. Like there's that, and then you can take some time while you're in that job to think about, to take the space. But a lot of people didn't have the luxury of like having a year or two off to figure it out. They had to get right back into the workforce, and I think there's an element of like, I was a bartender for a while early in my career because I needed to make some more money and it wasn't what I wanted to do. But you just kind of do what you got to do sometimes. So I think that's okay. There's no shame in that. In fact, you're always going to learn something. You're going to meet new people, and you'll have some time to really think what else you might want to do, or how else you might want to re-enter the workforce. I saw that Wendy O'Sullivan, who with the Park Service, had asked this question. And from the government standpoint, uh, it's tough if you're still there. Uh, I mean, it's almost like Stockholm kind of like syndrome. Like, why, why me? Why am I left over? And I think the level of disruption and chaos in some places is especially high, and it just makes that difficult. Lisa, to your point, there was no reorganization plan. There was just like let's see if we can get a 30% reduction in the workforce, and so. I think those are challenging. I'd say one thing that I've found in a similar situation is to have a tether to something that is stable. So there could be some outside organizations that work closely with government that are not as affected, and to be able to kind of, suction cup onto them a bit, and to really have a little bit of a mooring, if you will, of stability that could be a place for your own sanctuary and sanity, but also some perspective on what's going on, and why your work is still important.
Thanks. Love these answers. One of the questions, this might be for you, Maureen, or Kirsten, and it's come up in a couple of the questions, which is when you're trying to evaluate people inside your organizations for leadership potential, it's 1 year, 3 years. How do you do this in a way that it doesn't become personal or divisive or demoralizing if they don't feel like they're the chosen? Or how do you keep them? I mean, and your goal is not to move them out, right? But you're not ready to move them out, but you want to. How do you just make it so it's not a divisive? Like the old things where the consulting firms would lay off 10% every year. It's not that, but like, how do you really still make it like that's a legitimate conversation and doesn't have to be demoralizing? I guess. And feel free. Anybody can answer it. But I was looking at you, Maureen and Kirsten, because I know you've had to do this a number of times in your careers.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think that something that Maureen actually said earlier really resonates that I would kind of build on, which is that and in certain organizations, when you have, a lot of change, and sometimes that's growth, sometimes that's, mission shift or funding shift or, whatever external landscape shift, the need for different types of leadership changes at different times in the organization's history. And so, sometimes leadership growth is not just growing, from one role to the next and more senior in the same organization. Sometimes it's, people building a skill set, and then, at some point they kind of top out within that organization, and the next step up is to leave the organization and become a higher level leader at another organization. I think that when I think about some of the biggest sort of success stories at Revolution Foods were the people who left their director level roles at Revolution Foods to go become executive directors of other organizations. And, sort of similar to what Maureen was saying about the kind of like leadership pipeline. Sorry, I'm realizing the sunlight is coming in. And so, just like being explicit about some of those conversations, that, sometimes the next step in leadership is into a different organization. Is not always just a linear pathway, rungs on a ladder within the same organization. And I would say that's also true for small organizations where you just don't have, there's not enough room for everybody to get promoted to, senior director of every role, right? There's sort of inherent hierarchy in organizations.
But sunlight gives you an aura of an oracle there, Kirsten.
Yeah. Well, she is.
Close the blinds here.
If you know her, she is. So
I know, right? I can feel your radiant light all the way over here.
Yeah. For sure. Maureen,
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think what Keir said is really true. And I guess I would just do a yes end, which is, I mean, my organization is, big in budget because we're doing something very expensive, building affordable housing. But, we only have 50 people on our team. So we're not a huge organization by, any means compared to like Goodwill, where I had 700 employees, right? So I think it's just the difference of helping people understand that you believe in them that you believe in their leadership, that you want to see their leadership expressed no matter what the role is. We have tried really hard at Habitat to help people help build a pipeline of leadership so that people can see a path, because otherwise you do train people, invest a lot in them, and then they leave. And especially because so many of our areas are so specialized, whether it's construction, whether it's mortgage lending, whether it's volunteer services management. It's a complex, sort of small but mighty group of people doing different things. And I think just trying to help people see that their leadership and how they show up. We've implemented the EOS tracking system, which I completely love because it's just made teams use a system where they're really effective and they're checking and holding each other accountable. And I think that's actually built more leadership because it's given people more ownership and agency of their part of that equation. And then I guess the last thing I would say is just, I don't we don't do anything alone, and Will mentioned CLTs. So we're doing a lot of partnerships with Community Land Trust right now because they have a special expertise and we have a special expertise, and we're finding a way to come together and actually do some pretty magical work together. And I think you can also see and meet and interact with other leaders in that forum too. And so again, it's like keeping those relationships, keeping that network going, seeing where there's leaders that are showing up in different ways, trying to show up as your own authentic self, with all your vulnerabilities and all your strengths, and, continue to hone those and stay curious and stay as a learner. It's not, there's no lecturing going on, it's like, how are we leaning into something together and being our best selves together. And I think that, all of that for me is about, people developing their leadership skills. And there are people who I have who are amazing leaders who don't want to be out in front. They want to be behind the scenes, doing operations, doing different things. And they're as important as I am in what they do. And so it's not this sort of like hierarchy of value. It's this hierarchy of, ultimately like decisions. And any CEO who makes decisions in a vacuum without their team being on board, I would guess is probably not building a leaderful organization.
Thank you. I'm going to throw out one more question, and I'm going to ask you all just to give us a closing. If we've had a great conversation here, we do need to start to wrap up. But if they forgot everything else, what you would want them to remember from this conversation. So that would be my final question, each of you, in about 30 seconds or less. But the question I want to get to before that, so I'll give you a minute or two to think about it, is there's a question about interim leadership, and just curious. Your thoughts on interim executive directors or interim directors or interim staff as part of a succession planning process. I'm not throwing out to anybody in particular. I know you all have had experience with it. So anyone who feels moved.
I mean, I'll say one thing about, and this is sort of coming from somebody who I know who has, made an intentional decision to become an interim CEO as a, sort of as a part of her career path. And one thing that she has said is that, a key sort of decision point in deciding whether an interim CEO or senior leader is the right decision is, whether there's a specific purpose for needing an interim, right? Like, do you just need more time to find the right person? And do you, or is there something that an interim person could come in and you're sort of looking for somebody with one skill set who might be different than the long-term CEO that you're looking for, but then being really explicit about the intention behind the interim and is that and being really clear with that interim. And in her mind, one of the best practices in interim CEO leadership is that person is not actually a candidate for the future CEO job, and that helps to make that really clear what the intention is behind their tenure at the helm. Because it can get muddy, I think, if you have somebody in an interim and then you're doing a search for a new one, and it's unclear whether that person is, sort of incumbent or not, and So I think, like everything, having real explicit intention and communication about the goals of that choice, and the reasoning behind and for how long, and sort of what are the terms of the potential future engagement in the role. That's to avoid the kind of grayness of an interim appointment. I think those are all kind of important considerations.
Yeah,
Great. Well, maybe jump in, Will.
it just depends, to Kristen said, like there's so many different, thinking like 8 different
Mhm.
examples of that. Is it because of a failed search, or is it too short? The CEO got a new job, or there was a problem, or they got fired, whatever. There's lots of different circumstances that kind of set it up, and then the other side of the equation is like, do you put somebody who's already in the organization in that slot? Do they have to disqualify themselves for wanting the job? There's lots of different ways of going about it. I think you just have to diagnose the situation and kind of calibrate the response accordingly. So I don't think there's any cookie cutter to the point that Kirsten and I are making on this. It's very tailored to the circumstances, but you just got to be thoughtful and deliberate about how you do it.
Thank you. So let's move to our wrap-up question, and love to have your kind of takeaway, on this topic. Anything you've heard today, or anything you want them to remember. That one of the things one of my mentors in teaching always taught me. So just think about what is it that you want people to remember, and just focus on that, because they forget most of it. So what do you want people to remember from this conversation or this topic? Lisa, I see you looking ready.
Remember that, and think about your organization as being always in a process of becoming. And so keep a mindset of impermanence and a mindset of succession planning with that mindset of impermanence.
Love it. Kirsten.
I would say don't make succession planning taboo. Make it a part of explicit conversations.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Will, how about you? And then I'll give you kind of a final word, Maureen.
I think it's similar to what Lisa said. She used the word becoming. For me, it's about where you're going as an organization, and to be to create some space for that. What Kristen said too, like got to make sure that you actually do that. The other thing I was going to say that Lisa taught me today, Cleve, was that we are really part of one big organism. And I use the word ecosystem in my space, but we're, Maureen, you said it's unfortunate sometimes when they go work somewhere else, but if we kind of hold the space that the enterprise is social impact, then we're all part of the same organism, and we're just helping different parts of it. And I think that's a really good way to hold the work that we're all doing. So thanks.
Love that. Maureen, bring us home.
All right. I agree with everything. And I do think, we all are part of it. And I love the regenerative thing you brought up, Lisa. And I think Kirsten, the taboo, take that away. Will, it is. It shouldn't be scary when someone goes, because they're going somewhere else to lead in their way and have impact. And some of us have gone into organizations and it wasn't right. And we've gone on and done other good things, but we did good things. You just kind of keep it going. So my thing is, I guess what I want you to remember is, every experience is showing up in your life for a reason, and you're bringing that forward into the next best and great thing. And I love the idea of, appreciating the past and celebrating the present and the opportunity to move forward, but then just dreaming with wild abandon about the future. And don't forget to have fun, and don't forget to bring joy and gratitude to this work, because it is very hard and it is extremely rewarding.
Mm. Wow, what a great way to end. I knew you would do this. Bring us home. So thank you all panelists. I was promoting this webinar with some superlatives on social media, and you can see why, right? If you read I'm talking to the panelists, right? To the participants, what a great group of panelists. You are people that I've admired for so long, and you've done so much good in the world and have so much wisdom. So I just, huge, you can see the applause, and thank you. Really, I can't even imagine a better group of 4 people I'd want to spend an hour and 15 minutes with, probably days with. I wish we could do this in person. Oh, look at all this. Oh, that's cool. Look at that. So thank you for giving of your time. I know you all have so much you're juggling, and it just means the world to all of us on this call, because you have so much wisdom to impart, and you gave us so much wisdom. We are just a couple of logistics. I'm just going to put up a slide. Oh, I guess I'm putting up the Oh, the poll, yeah. So if you could give us some feedback, there is a poll on giving us some feedback on the session. We always are interested in making these better and being responsive to our community that shows up. Every one of our webinars is different. Some are panel conversation like this, some are very, very content specific. And so this webinar came out of your feedback from prior webinars. I'm just gonna, we also, my team is gonna, the Potrero Zoom, there's a number of us here are gonna stay around if you want to continue the conversation. I want to be respectful of the panelists' time and their other commitments, so they'll drop off in a couple moments, but just also want to let you know that next month's webinar is on February 25th. It's led by our senior consultant, Grace Johnson, one of our senior consultants, Grace Johnson. Grace is phenomenal, and I highly encourage you. This is the topics listed here, but so often it's about the presenters, as you just learned, and how good they are. Grace is a senior consultant who was a captain in the Navy, and she humbly says she drove ships for a living. But she was really, really influential in bringing women into leadership roles in the Navy. And she's phenomenal. She went to Haas School at Berkeley and had her MBA, and she's just done phenomenal work. So you don't want to miss that. Grace is phenomenal, and that's on February 25th. We have our newsletter. You can scan there if you're not on it, or LinkedIn. There's my email and our general email. I'm always happy to answer questions or be a resource. And love, this is, if you want to continue the conversation today, feel free. I know the panelists have to get on. Of course, you're welcome to stay, but we'll let people go after this. But let's just have one more round of applause to our incredible panelists. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Lisa. And with that, we'll wrap it up and turn off the recording and just hang around for a little informal conversation if people just want to chat. But again, thank you so much for your time and wisdom.